This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In the spring of 1883, 12 men died across the southwestern territories over the course of 7 weeks. Their bodies were discovered scattered across nearly 200 miles of desert terrain, from the Sacramento Mountains of New Mexico to the Chiricahua Range near the Arizona border. Each death was methodical, deliberate, and left little evidence of struggle. What tied these deaths together was not immediately apparent to territorial authorities, who initially classified them as separate incidents involving animal attacks, exposure, or conflicts with local tribes. It wasn't until a deputy marshal named Uriah Kowalski connected the victims through their shared involvement in a trading operation that the pattern emerged. But by then, the last of the 12 was already dead. The story begins not with violence, but with what seemed like an opportunity. In late February of 1883, a group of independent traders operating out of Fort Stanton in Lincoln County, New Mexico, learned about an unguarded cache of supplies approximately 40 miles south of their post. The information came from a Pueblo scout named Vicente Arroyo, who mentioned during a card game that he had seen smoke signals suggesting a temporary Mescalero Apache encampment had been hastily abandoned near the Capitan Gap. The reason for the abandonment was unclear, but Arroyo suggested it might have been related to a dispute between clan leaders or a response to recent cavalry movements in the area. Among those present for this conversation was Silas Merrick, a former buffalo hunter from Kansas who had shifted to trading when the herds collapsed. Merrick was 41 years old, solidly built, with weathered features that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He had a reputation for being calculating rather than reckless, which made what happened next somewhat out of character. According to the testimony Vicente Arroyo later gave to Marshal Kowalski, Merrick's immediate reaction was measured. He asked specific questions about the location, the estimated size of the cache, and whether anyone else might know about it. When Arroyo couldn't provide definitive answers, Merrick reportedly nodded and changed the subject. What Arroyo didn't know was that Merrick was facing significant financial pressure. Records from the Fort Stanton quartermaster show that Merrick owed nearly $600 to various creditors, a substantial sum for that time and place. His trading business had suffered a series of setbacks, including the loss of 2 pack animals to disease and a failed contract to supply a mining camp that had closed unexpectedly. In a letter discovered years later among territorial archives, Merrick's common-law wife, Lucinda Hartwell, wrote to her sister in St. Louis describing their situation as desperate. Within 3 days of hearing about the cache, Merrick had assembled a group. He approached men he knew from the trading circuits, individuals who shared his financial pressures or his willingness to take calculated risks. There was Cordell Vance, a former Confederate soldier from Georgia who had drifted west after the war and never quite settled. His service records show repeated disciplinary actions for insubordination, though he was also noted as being skilled with horses and navigation. There was Phineas Galt, a sutler's assistant who had been dismissed from his position at Fort Stanton for unexplained shortages in inventory. Mordecai Brennan, an Irish immigrant who worked intermittently as a teamster and had a reputation for reliability, if not warmth. These were not outlaws or violent men by reputation. They were individuals at the margins trying to survive in an unforgiving landscape. The group grew to 12. Among them were the Deacon brothers, Aloysius and Benedict, who ran a small freight operation between Las Cruces and Alamogordo. There was Jasper Quillen, a taciturn man from Tennessee about whom little was recorded beyond his presence. Nathaniel Pruitt, who kept a detailed journal that would later become crucial evidence. Gideon Satterwhite, a former railroad surveyor. Lachlan McCrae, a Scots immigrant, And finally, two men who joined at the last moment, Barnabas Fitch and Thaddeus Warwick, both of whom worked occasionally as ranch hands in the territory. They left Fort Stanton on February 27, 1883, telling various associates they were heading south to investigate trading opportunities with settlements near the Tularosa Basin. The weather was clear, cold at night, but warming during the day, typical for late winter in that region. They traveled with 4 wagons, 16 horses, and supplies for a 2-week journey. Nathaniel Pruitt's journal from this period describes the mood as optimistic but cautious. What they found 3 days later, near a remote canyon system south of the Sacramento Mountains, was indeed a cache, but its contents would become a matter of intense speculation. According to Pruitt's journal, they discovered a concealed depression in the rocky terrain, covered with brush and barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Inside were numerous items, including dried meat, several parfleche containers filled with what appeared to be medicinal herbs and ceremonial materials, tools, weapons including 3 older model rifles, and ammunition, blankets, and various trade goods including silver conchos and worked leather. The total value was estimated by Merrick at somewhere between $400 and $600. What made this discovery controversial, even within the group, was what else they found. Among the items was a bundle wrapped in doe skin, which when opened revealed items that Galt immediately recognized as ceremonial. He had spent time among the Mescalero as a young man working at a mission school. According to Pruitt's account, Galt argued strongly for leaving the ceremonial items untouched. The items weren't trade goods, but family possessions, clan items, he insisted. If they took these, they weren't just thieves, but something worse. Merrick's response was practical rather than cruel. He pointed out that they had already committed to taking the cash, that the items had value, and that the Mescalero who had left them were unlikely to be able to prove ownership or even know who had taken them. The vote among the 12 was not unanimous. Galt refused to participate in dividing the ceremonial items. The Deacon brothers expressed reservations, but ultimately went along. They divided everything evenly, packed it into their wagons, and departed the area. Pruitt's final entry from that location, dated March 2, 1883, notes something that would prove prophetic. Galt had barely spoken since they made the decision, kept looking back toward the canyon. When Pruitt asked what troubled him, Galt said only that the Mescalero would know that they always know. When asked how they could possibly know, given that they found the cache abandoned with no witnesses, Galt replied that the Mescalero don't abandon things, they hide them for later. The return journey to Fort Stanton took 5 days. The weather turned during the trip, bringing unseasonable cold and wind that made travel miserable. According to testimony from a rancher named Cornelius Marsh, whose property lay along their route, the group stopped at his station on March 5th to water their horses and purchase some feed. Marsh later told Marshal Kowalski that the men seemed tense, though he attributed it at the time to the difficult weather conditions. He specifically remembered Merrick paying for their supplies with a silver concho that Marsh recognized as Mescalero craftwork. They reached Fort Stanton on March 7, 1883. Over the next 2 days, they divided their acquisition, and the group dispersed. Most returned to their normal activities or traveled to sell their shares of the goods. There's no indication in any surviving records that they saw themselves as having done anything particularly dangerous. Theft from unguarded caches was common in the territory, though usually from abandoned prospector camps or military supply dumps, not from tribal deposits. The first death occurred on March 15, 1883, 8 days after their return. Jasper Quillen was found dead on the outskirts of Alamogordo, approximately 60 miles from Fort Stanton. His body was discovered by a freight hauler named Delmore Potts, who reported it to the local sheriff. The initial examination suggested Quillen had died from a fall. His horse was found nearby, uninjured but skittish. Quillen's body showed significant trauma consistent with being thrown from a horse and striking rocks, including a fractured skull and broken ribs. What wasn't immediately noted, and only became significant later when the bodies were re-examined, was the positioning. Quillen's body was found face down, arms at his sides, legs straight. This is not typical of someone who has fallen from a horse. Usually such victims are found in contorted positions, with limbs splayed, suggesting they had tried to catch themselves. Additionally, Quillen's saddle was found undisturbed on his horse, still properly cinched. If the horse had bucked or stumbled, the saddle would likely have shifted. These details were noted in the report, but not initially considered suspicious. A second detail would emerge only during Marshal Kowalski's later investigation. Approximately 20 feet from where Quillen's body was found, a rancher repairing fence line discovered 3 small stones, arranged in a precise triangle pattern. The stones had been placed deliberately, not naturally distributed. At the time, this was dismissed as unrelated. The Mescalero were known to leave markers, but stone arrangements were common for various purposes. No one connected this to Quillen's death until much later. The second death followed 6 days after the first. Barnabas Fitch, one of the 2 men who had joined Merrick's group at the last moment, was found in his rented room in Las Cruces on March 21st. The landlady, Mrs. Vera Hodgkins, discovered him when he failed to appear for 2 days, and she became concerned about the rent he owed. According to her testimony, she knocked repeatedly, received no answer, and finally used her key to enter. Fitch was in his bed, apparently having died in his sleep. His expression, she later said, was one of terror. The doctor who examined Fitch's body, a local physician named Dr. Oswald Kensington, initially attributed the death to heart failure. Fitch was 36 years old, not particularly old, but he had a history of occasional chest pain, according to interviews with associates. Dr. Kensington noted some unusual characteristics in his report. The body showed signs of extreme stress, including dilated pupils and a degree of muscle rigidity unusual for someone who had simply died of natural heart failure. More significantly, Dr. Kensington noted scratches on the inside of Fitch's forearms, as though he had been clawing at himself. What Dr. Kensington didn't include in his official report, but mentioned in a private letter to a colleague, was something he observed in Fitch's room. The letter, discovered in 1968 during the cataloging of personal papers, donated to the University of New Mexico, describes that the deceased's bed was positioned such that he would have been facing the room's single window. The window was open, unusual given the cold nights they'd been experiencing. More peculiar was the condition of the floor beneath the window. There were marks, as though someone had stood there for some time, shifting weight from foot to foot. The marks were clear in the dust, but when the doctor mentioned them to the landlady, she seemed uncomfortable and changed the subject. The third death occurred in what appeared to be a different manner entirely. Thaddeus Warwick, Fitch's friend and the other last-minute addition to Merrick's expedition, disappeared on March 24th while traveling between Socorro and San Antonio, New Mexico. His horse was found 3 days later, wandering near the San Mateo Mountains. The saddlebags were still attached and contained Warwick's personal effects, including a small amount of money and a portion of the goods he had received from the divided cash. A search party organized by locals found Warwick's body on March 29th, approximately 8 miles from where his horse had been recovered. He was in a steep arroyo, partially covered by brush. The positioning suggested he had either fallen or been placed there deliberately. His body showed no obvious signs of violence, but the remote location and the separation from his horse raised questions. The local sheriff ruled the death accidental, suggesting Warwick had become disoriented, possibly during a dust storm that had passed through the area on March 25th, and had fallen while trying to find his way. An element that would only be connected to the other deaths later was reported by one of the men in the search party. A local rancher mentioned to several people that when they found Warwick's body, there was a peculiar arrangement of items nearby. Someone had placed 3 stones in a line leading away from the body. Again, this was noted but not considered significant at the time. By early April, 3 men from Merrick's group were dead, but there was no apparent reason to connect these deaths as part of a pattern. They had occurred in different locations, under different circumstances, and with different apparent causes. What would eventually link them was the methodical nature of the timing and the fact that all 3 had been part of the February expedition, but this connection wouldn't be made for several more weeks. The 4th victim was Mordecai Brennan. He died on April 3, 1883, in a saloon fire in Silver City. The fire started in the early morning hours when the establishment was closed. Brennan had been sleeping in a room above the saloon, as he often did when he was in town between freight runs. According to witnesses, the fire spread rapidly, and Brennan was overcome by smoke before he could escape. His body was found near the room's window, suggesting he had tried to get out, but was blocked by flames. What made this fire noteworthy, though not immediately suspicious, was its isolated nature. The saloon was destroyed, but surrounding buildings suffered minimal damage. The fire marshal determined the cause to be a lamp that had been left burning and subsequently tipped over. This explanation satisfied most observers, though the marshal privately expressed confusion about how the fire had spread so quickly given the construction of the building. More significantly, a bartender who lived nearby reported seeing someone in the alley behind the saloon shortly before the fire was noticed. When asked to describe the person, he could provide few details, saying only that it was a figure moving with purpose, average height, wearing dark clothing. The deaths continued through April. On April 9th, Gideon Satterwhite was found dead in his surveying camp north of Roswell. He had been working on a railroad expansion project and was camping alone while conducting measurements. A colleague who arrived to meet him discovered Satterwhite's body. The scene suggested he had simply not woken up one morning. His camp was undisturbed, his equipment organized, his food supplies intact. However, the camp's location added an element that would become increasingly significant. Satterwhite had been working in an area that bordered traditional Mescalero territory. His camp was positioned near an old trail system that the Mescalero had used for generations, but which had largely been abandoned following increased settlement and military pressure in the region. A detail mentioned in the colleague's initial report, but not emphasized, was that Satterwhite's surveying notes from the previous day were missing. Everything else was accounted for, but the most recent field notebook was gone. By mid-April, 6 men from the original 12 were dead. This was the point at which Deputy Marshal Uriah Kowalski began to notice a pattern. Kowalski was based in Santa Fe, but traveled extensively throughout the territory as part of his duties. He was 47 years old, a methodical man who had worked in law enforcement since the late 1860s. Unlike many territorial lawmen, Kowalski kept detailed personal records of cases and incidents he encountered, cross-referencing information from different counties and jurisdictions. It was this habit that led him to identify the connection between the deaths. According to Kowalski's case notes, which were preserved in the National Archives and only fully examined by researchers in 1967, he first became suspicious when he reviewed death reports from Lincoln, Donna Ana, and Sierra counties for the month of March. The clustering of deaths among men who were known to operate in the trading and freight business, occurring within a relatively short time frame, struck him as unusual. When 2 more deaths occurred in April, he began actively investigating. Kowalski's approach was systematic. He traveled to each location where a death had occurred, interviewed witnesses, and examined available evidence. He also did something that would prove crucial by asking questions about recent activities and associations of the deceased men. Through these inquiries, he learned that Quillen, Fitch, and Warwick had all been part of a group that had left Fort Stanton in late February. Further investigation revealed the other names, 12 men total. When Kowalski realized that all the deceased had been part of this group, he began to treat the deaths as potentially connected. His notes from April 18, 1883, include this entry describing that he'd confirmed at least 6 of the 12 men involved in the February expedition from Fort Stanton were now deceased, that local authorities had treated each as separate incidents. But the timing and connection between victims suggested something more deliberate. Kowalski's investigation led him to Nathaniel Pruitt, who at that point was staying in Albuquerque. Pruitt had not yet learned about all the deaths, only about Quillen and Brennan. When Kowalski informed him that 6 of their group were dead, Pruitt's reaction was one of immediate fear. He told the marshal about the expedition, the discovery of the cache, and the decision to take everything, including the ceremonial items. According to Kowalski's record of the conversation, Pruitt mentioned that Galt had warned them, said the Mescalero would know that they were taking things that weren't meant to be taken. Kowalski asked Pruitt if he had noticed anyone following him or anything unusual in recent weeks. Pruitt admitted that he had felt uneasy for days, as though being watched, but had attributed it to general anxiety about his financial situation and the harsh living conditions. He mentioned that he had seen, on 2 occasions, a figure at a distance when he was traveling, someone who seemed to be moving parallel to his path, but never approached. When Kowalski asked if Pruitt could describe this figure, he said only that it had been too far away to make out details, just a dark shape against the landscape. Kowalski's next step was to locate the other surviving members of the group. This proved more difficult than anticipated. Lachlan McCrae had left the territory entirely, heading back east according to a saloon-keeper in Socorro who knew him. The Deacon brothers had returned to their freight business and were somewhere between Las Cruces and El Paso. Phineas Galt was reported to be working at a ranch near the Texas border. Cordell Vance was in the mountains, possibly prospecting. Silas Merrick had been seen in Fort Stanton as recently as April 12th, but had since departed for an unknown destination. While Kowalski worked to track down the survivors, the deaths continued. On April 21st, Aloysius Deacon was found dead under his overturned wagon approximately 15 miles south of Las Cruces. The accident appeared straightforward. The wagon had slipped off the road while navigating a difficult section, rolling down an embankment. Deacon had been crushed beneath it. His brother Benedict, who had been traveling separately and was supposed to meet Aloysius later that day, discovered the scene. According to his statement to local authorities, the positioning of the wagon suggested that something had caused the horses to bolt, possibly a snake or a sudden sound. However, the horses themselves were found nearby, calm and apparently uninjured, which was inconsistent with the scenario of a panicked bolt. Benedict Deacon's own death occurred just 3 days later, on April 24th. He had been staying at a boarding house in Las Cruces, waiting to settle his brother's affairs. The landlord found him in his room, dead in a chair positioned near the window. Like Barnabas Fitch before him, Benedict appeared to have died suddenly, with no obvious external cause. The expression on his face was described by the landlord as resigned, as though he'd been expecting something, and it had finally come. The local doctor who examined the body attributed the death to heart failure, noting that Benedict had likely been under severe emotional strain following his brother's death. What the doctor didn't mention in his official report, but told the landlord privately, was that Benedict's room showed signs of a struggle, though not with another person. The chair where he died had been moved from its usual position. There were scuff marks on the floor, suggesting he had stood up repeatedly, then sat back down. The window was open despite the cold night, and on the window sill, barely visible, were 3 small marks scored into the wood, evenly spaced. By late April, 8 of the original 12 were dead. The remaining 4 were Merrick, Vance, Galt, and Pruitt. Marshal Kowalski had managed to locate Pruitt and convince him to stay in Albuquerque under protective observation. Kowalski also sent telegrams to law enforcement contacts throughout the territory, alerting them to be on watch for the other 3 men and to provide them protection if located. The Marshal's communications show his growing conviction that the deaths were not coincidental. In a telegram to the territorial governor dated April 26, 1883, Kowalski described investigating a series of deaths among a group of traders, that 8 men were deceased in 6 weeks under varying circumstances, and that the pattern suggested deliberate targeting. The response he received was less supportive than he had hoped. Territorial authorities were skeptical that the deaths were connected, pointing out the different causes and locations. They suggested Kowalski was seeing patterns where none existed. The authorization for additional resources was denied. Kowalski would have to continue the investigation largely on his own. Lachlan McCrae was the 9th to die. He had made it as far as Kansas City, where he had intended to book passage on a train back to the East Coast. On April 29th, his body was found in an alley behind a boarding house. The cause of death was determined to be exposure and intoxication. McCrae had apparently spent an evening drinking heavily, then attempted to walk back to his lodgings, but collapsed in the alley. The cold night, combined with his impaired state, proved fatal. What linked this death to the others was a detail that would only be discovered weeks later. A clerk at the boarding house, going through McCrae's possessions to determine if there were any next of kin to contact, found a letter McCrae had been writing. The letter was addressed to a brother in Edinburgh, Scotland. Most of it dealt with mundane matters, descriptions of his travels, comments on the American territories. But the final paragraph, written in a noticeably shakier hand than the rest, described that he believed he was being hunted not by law or any conventional threat, but by someone who knew what they did in February. He'd seen the same figure 3 times now, always at a distance, always watching. He thought putting distance between himself and New Mexico would provide safety, but he was no longer certain distance mattered. This letter was forwarded to Kansas City police, who in turn sent it to territorial authorities in Santa Fe. It reached Marshal Kowalski's desk on May 7th, more than a week after McCrae's death. The description of being followed, combined with McCrae's explicit connection to the February expedition, solidified Kowalski's theory. Cordell Vance died on May 2, 1883. He had been prospecting in the San Mateo Mountains, working a claim he hoped would yield enough to settle his debts and perhaps start over somewhere else. A fellow prospector, a man named Jedediah Crane, found Vance's body at his camp. The scene was eerily similar to Satterwhite's death. Vance appeared to have simply not woken up. His camp was in order, his tools laid out, his supplies secured. Crane's statement to the Socorro County Sheriff included a detail that went beyond the immediate circumstances of Vance's death. He mentioned that when he had visited Vance at this camp 3 days earlier, Vance had been agitated and uncommunicative. When Crane asked what was bothering him, Vance initially refused to discuss it, then finally admitted he had been seeing tracks around his camp. Not the tracks of animals, but human footprints, always appearing overnight, always leading to a spot overlooking his site, then leading away. Vance had tried following these tracks once, but lost them in the rocky terrain. The Socorro sheriff investigated the site personally. His report confirms the presence of tracks matching Crane's description, though the sheriff noted they could have belonged to any number of people who might have been in the area for legitimate reasons. More interesting was the sheriff's observation that near the overlook position, someone had arranged a small collection of stones in a pattern. The sheriff, who had some familiarity with Mescalero markers from his years in the territory, recognized the arrangement as similar to those used by Apache scouts to indicate observation points. By early May, 10 of the 12 were dead. Only Silas Merrick and Phineas Galt remained. Marshal Kowalski had successfully maintained contact with Galt, who was staying at a ranch near Fort Hancock, Texas, working as a handyman and avoiding travel. Galt had agreed to remain at this location until Kowalski could resolve the situation, or at least understand it better. Communication with Galt was maintained through weekly telegrams, with Galt checking in at the Fort Hancock telegraph office every Sunday afternoon. On May 12th, Galt failed to appear for his scheduled telegram. The telegraph operator, knowing that the marshal in Santa Fe was expecting contact, sent a message to the ranch where Galt was staying. The ranch owner confirmed that Galt had left the ranch on May 10th, saying he needed to travel to Fort Hancock to handle some business. He had not returned. Marshal Kowalski immediately traveled to Fort Hancock to investigate. What he found there would provide the most direct evidence yet of what had been occurring. According to Kowalski's detailed report filed on May 16, 1883, Galt's body was discovered in a small canyon approximately 3 miles from Fort Hancock. A local rancher had spotted buzzards and investigated. Galt had been dead for several days. Unlike many of the previous victims, the cause of Galt's death was unambiguous. He had suffered massive trauma consistent with a fall from height. However, the positioning of his body and the specific location where he was found raised questions. Kowalski's examination of the scene revealed that Galt's body was at the bottom of a canyon that required deliberate effort to reach. The approach was not along any standard trail or path. To get where Galt had ended up, he would have had to leave the main route deliberately and make his way through difficult terrain. Furthermore, the fall that killed him would have required him to have been at a specific point along the canyon rim, a location with no obvious reason to visit. More significantly, Kowalski found evidence at the scene that convinced him his theory about the nature of the threat was correct. Near the canyon rim, at the point from which Galt likely fell, there were signs of a struggle. Not a fight between two people, but the marks of someone resisting or trying to escape, while being physically pressured toward the edge. Boot prints in the soft soil showed Galt had backpedaled, dug in his heels, then suddenly gone forward and over. The lack of blood or other evidence at the rim suggested he hadn't been struck or stabbed, merely maneuvered. And perhaps most tellingly, there were other tracks at the scene, leading to the rim and then away. These tracks were made by moccasins, not boots. This was the first concrete physical evidence linking any of the deaths to native presence. Kowalski collected samples of the soil impressions and sketched their patterns. His report includes a detailed analysis of the tracks, noting that they showed characteristics consistent with Mescalero footwear, including the slight outward cant typical of their construction and the specific wear pattern visible in the impressions. For the first time, Kowalski had physical evidence to support what he had suspected for weeks. The deaths were the result of a systematic campaign of retribution, and the perpetrators were Mescalero Apache. With this confirmation, Kowalski faced a difficult situation. By 1883, most Mescalero had been forced onto reservations, primarily at the Mescalero Apache Reservation established in 1873 in south-central New Mexico. However, not all Mescalero had accepted reservation life, and small groups still maintained a presence in the mountains and remote areas. Pursuing justice for the deaths would require not only identifying specific individuals responsible, but also navigating the complex and often hostile relationship between territorial authorities and the Apache nations. Kowalski's approach was to attempt communication with Mescalero leadership, both on and off the reservation. Through intermediaries, including a trader named Otto Rasmussen, who had extensive contacts among the Mescalero, Kowalski sent messages indicating he understood the motivation for the deaths, acknowledged the wrong that had been committed by Merrick's group, and requested a meeting to discuss resolution. The responses he received were either non-committal or indicated that the matter was considered settled according to Apache justice, and required no further discussion with American authorities. This left Silas Merrick, the last survivor. Kowalski had lost track of Merrick's location in mid-April. His last confirmed sighting had been in Fort Stanton on April 12th. After that, various reports placed him in different locations, but none were verified. Kowalski believed Merrick was moving frequently, possibly aware of the danger he faced and attempting to avoid it through constant relocation. Merrick surfaced on May 20, 1883, in El Paso. He walked into the sheriff's office voluntarily, identified himself, and requested protection. The El Paso sheriff, recognizing the name from the marshal's telegrams, immediately contacted Kowalski. The marshal arrived in El Paso 2 days later to find Merrick under guard in a jail cell, not as a prisoner, but as the safest location available to him. Kowalski's interview with Merrick, conducted over several sessions between May 22 and May 24, 1883, provided crucial information. According to Kowalski's notes, Merrick was exhausted, paranoid, and convinced he would not survive much longer. He described weeks of being pursued, of seeing the same figure at a distance whenever he stopped anywhere for more than a day, of finding signs that someone had been in his camps during the night. He had tried everything to evade his pursuer, traveling at night, changing direction randomly, even attempting to lose himself in crowded towns. Nothing had worked. When Kowalski asked specifically about the February expedition and what they had taken, Merrick provided details that clarified the severity of the transgression. The cache they had discovered was not simply abandoned property, as they had rationalized at the time. It was a deliberately hidden deposit, the kind that Mescalero clans used when they knew they would need to relocate quickly and plan to return later. More significantly, among the ceremonial items they had taken were objects with specific clan significance, including what Merrick described as a painted case containing things he didn't understand, but that Galt said were sacred to a particular family or bloodline. Merrick admitted that he had known, even as they were taking these items, that they were crossing a line. His justification had been desperation and the belief that the Mescalero, constrained by reservation boundaries and military oversight, would be unable to effectively respond even if they learned about the theft. He had been wrong. Kowalski asked Merrick if he had ever seen his pursuer clearly enough to provide a description. Merrick's response was both specific and unsettling. He'd only ever seen him once directly, and that was 3 weeks ago, near Las Cruces. He was camped in a draw, thought he'd been careful. He woke just before dawn, and the man was standing at the edge of his camp, maybe 20 feet away. He didn't approach, didn't speak. He was Apache, that was clear, maybe 35 or 40 years old, lean, wearing traditional clothing. What struck Merrick was his stillness. He wasn't hiding, wasn't attempting to be threatening. He was just there, watching. After maybe a minute, he turned and walked away. Merrick packed up immediately and ran. But he knew from that moment that he was only being let to run, that it could have ended there if the man had wanted. This description provided Kowalski with a working theory about how the deaths had been accomplished. An experienced Apache warrior, particularly one with extensive knowledge of the territory and tracking skills, could have systematically located each member of the group despite their scattered locations. The methods of death, which had varied from apparent accidents to deaths that mimicked natural causes, suggested someone with detailed knowledge of how to kill efficiently while minimizing evidence. After consulting with the territorial governor's office and receiving conflicting guidance, Kowalski made a decision that was both pragmatic and controversial. He arranged for Merrick to be transported under guard to Santa Fe, where he would remain in protective custody while Kowalski attempted to negotiate with Mescalero representatives. The goal was to determine if there might be some form of resolution that would satisfy Apache justice while sparing Merrick's life. The transport to Santa Fe began on May 26, 1883. Merrick was accompanied by 4 armed guards, including Kowalski himself. They traveled by coach, taking the most direct route through relatively populated areas to minimize exposure to attack. The journey would normally take 3 days. They made it to the outskirts of Socorro on the evening of May 27th, where they stopped at a way station to rest the horses and resupply. That night, Silas Merrick disappeared from a locked room while the guards maintained watch outside. The circumstances of Merrick's disappearance were investigated extensively but never satisfactorily explained. According to the guards' statements, Merrick had been placed in a secure room with a single door and 1 small window, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, and barred with iron grating. The guards maintained position in the hallway outside the door throughout the night, taking shifts. None reported hearing anything unusual. At dawn, when they went to collect Merrick for departure, they found the room empty. The door was still locked from the outside. The window bars were intact. Merrick was simply gone. A thorough search of the way station and surrounding area revealed no trace of Merrick. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no clothing, no indication of how he might have exited the room or where he might have gone. Marshal Kowalski personally examined every aspect of the room, looking for hidden panels or any structural feature that might explain the disappearance. He found nothing. Merrick's body was discovered on June 8, 1883, approximately 12 miles from the way station, in a remote area of the Magdalena Mountains. A prospector found him while searching for a lost pack mule. According to the prospector's statement, Merrick's body was positioned in a small clearing, lying face up with his arms at his sides. There was no apparent cause of death, no wounds, no signs of violence. He appeared, in the prospector's words, like he'd just laid down and decided to stop living. The doctor who examined Merrick's body in Socorro noted the same characteristics that had appeared in several of the other deaths, the expression suggesting resignation rather than struggle, the complete lack of defensive injuries, and evidence of extreme stress in the days before death. What made Merrick's death distinctive was what was found with the body. Arranged around him in a precise pattern were items from the cache he and his group had stolen in February. The painted case containing ceremonial objects was there, unopened. Several of the silver conchos were placed in a circle around his torso, and most significantly, propped against his body, was a small wooden marker carved with symbols that an Apache interpreter later identified as clan signs, along with marks indicating justice had been served. This was the first and only time that items from the stolen cache had been recovered. Marshal Kowalski took possession of these items and, through his intermediaries, arranged for their return to Mescalero representatives. The transfer occurred on June 15, 1883, at a neutral location near the reservation boundary. According to the trader who facilitated the exchange, the Mescalero who received the items acknowledged the return, but offered no information about what had occurred or who had been responsible. When asked if the matter was now considered settled, the response was direct. What was taken has been returned. Those who took it have answered. There is nothing more to discuss. In the months following Merrick's death, Marshal Kowalski attempted to compile a comprehensive report on what had occurred. He faced significant challenges in this effort. Territorial authorities were reluctant to officially acknowledge that the deaths had been part of a coordinated campaign of retribution, fearing it might legitimize what they considered murder. Military officials were concerned about the implications for reservation management and control. Kowalski's final official report, submitted to the territorial governor in August 1883, documents the deaths in detail, presents evidence of their connection to the February expedition, and acknowledges the likelihood that they were the result of deliberate action taken in response to the theft of sacred items. However, he stopped short of explicitly naming the perpetrators as Mescalero Apache or calling for any punitive action. His conclusion reads that the deaths of these 12 individuals appear to have resulted from their involvement in an action that violated principles held sacred by the native inhabitants of this territory. While he cannot provide definitive evidence of the specific mechanism by which these deaths were accomplished, the pattern and timing suggest a deliberate and systematic response. The territorial governor accepted this recommendation, and the case was officially closed in September 1883. Over the years, the events of 1883 became the subject of local legend and speculation. Various accounts circulated, some accurate, many embellished. The story of the 12 traitors became a cautionary tale told in saloons and around campfires, a reminder of the consequences of disrespecting sacred boundaries. In 1958, a historian named Dr. Wilbur Kensington, working at the University of New Mexico, became interested in the case while researching territorial law enforcement. He obtained access to Marshall Kowalski's papers, which had been donated to the university following Kowalski's death in 1901. Dr. Kensington's examination of these papers, combined with other archival research, led to a comprehensive study of the deaths and their context. Dr. Kensington was able to track down several relatives of the deceased men and obtain family records, including Nathaniel Pruitt's journal, which had been preserved by Pruitt's grandson. He also conducted interviews with elderly Mescalero, who remembered hearing stories about the events from their parents or grandparents. These interviews provided crucial context about the significance of the stolen items and the cultural imperative for retribution. One interview in particular, conducted in 1960 with a Mescalero elder named Joseph Chino, offered insight that had not been available to Kowalski in 1883. According to Chino, the cash that Merrick's group had stolen belonged to a specific family within the Mescalero, a family with a strong warrior tradition. The head of that family, who would have been in his 30s in 1883, was known as someone who had resisted reservation confinement and maintained the old ways. When the family discovered their cash had been violated and the sacred items taken, this individual took on the responsibility of recovering them and punishing those responsible. The action was undertaken with the knowledge and tacit approval of clan elders, who viewed it as necessary to maintain honor and demonstrate that violations of sacred trust would not be tolerated, even given the changed political circumstances. Chino was careful not to provide the individual's name, saying that some stories were meant to be remembered without specific attribution. However, he confirmed that the person in question survived the events of 1883, lived for many more years, and was remembered within the Mescalero community as someone who had upheld their traditions and values during a difficult period of cultural pressure and change. The story of the 12 traitors serves as a reminder that the American Southwest in the 1880s was a place where different worlds collided, where competing systems of law and justice operated in the same physical space, and where actions had consequences that crossed cultural boundaries. Marshall Kowalski's careful investigation and detailed documentation preserved information that might otherwise have been lost, but even his thorough work could not fully resolve the questions raised by the events. One of the enduring aspects of this story is the respect it demonstrates for capability and purpose. Whoever was responsible for tracking and killing 12 men across hundreds of miles using methods that ranged from making deaths appear accidental to approaching victims in their secured rooms possessed remarkable skill and determination. The systematic nature of the campaign, the precision of the targeting, and the eventual recovery of the stolen items all point to someone operating with clear objectives and the ability to accomplish them despite significant obstacles. What can be said with certainty is that in the spring and early summer of 1883, 12 men died across the southwestern territories under circumstances that suggested coordination and purpose. These deaths were connected to their involvement in the theft of a cache belonging to the Mescalero Apache, including items of sacred significance. The deaths were investigated by territorial authorities but were never prosecuted. The individuals responsible were never officially identified or punished under American law. The stolen items were eventually recovered and returned. And in the decades since, the story has persisted as a reminder of a time and place where old rules and new rules coexisted uneasily, and where justice, depending on one's perspective, was either served or evaded.